What if some acts of kindness, even those born from the purest hearts, can unknowingly block divine blessings? What if there is a hidden biblical truth that many spiritual leaders choose to ignore, an instruction that challenges our instincts to help everyone in need? Behind the veneer of compassion lies a divine warning, a thin line between love and spiritual danger. Few realize that certain individuals, despite their struggles, may be meant to remain distant because true obedience sometimes requires separation, not rescue. This revelation shakes the foundation of what we believe about mercy and compassion, revealing a divine strategy to protect our destiny from toxic influences. Are we truly helping, or are we unknowingly sabotaging our spiritual calling? The darkness of this truth may be uncomfortable, but it is also necessary to understand the divine purpose behind divine boundaries. Prepare to uncover a divine whisper, an urgent message that might redefine your understanding of love, obedience, and divine justice. Because in the spiritual realm, what appears as mercy could be the very act that blocks your divine breakthrough. The question is, are you willing to see what has been hidden all along? In the silent depths of history, beneath the layers of time and tradition, there lies a story woven with divine truth. A story that echoes through the corridors of heaven and the hearts of men. It is a story of mercy and judgment, of love balanced with divine wisdom, and of boundaries set by the Almighty to preserve His divine order. Imagine the vast, darkened landscape of ancient Israel, where prophets once walked amidst the chaos of human failure and divine justice, their words echoing across desolate valleys and sacred mountains. In this sacred landscape, the voice of God once proclaimed a profound and unsettling command: to cease interceding for a people who had turned their hearts away, whose stubbornness had hardened like stone against the divine touch. It was not cruelty, but divine precision, a divine strategy to protect the integrity of His plan, to safeguard the purity of His blessing from being tainted by toxic rebellion. This divine whisper, often shrouded in mystery, hints at a divine blueprint that many have overlooked in their pursuit of mercy. It beckons us to see beyond superficial acts of kindness and to understand that divine love is not blind to the intricacies of the human soul. There are moments when God's mercy requires silence, when the most loving act is to step back and let divine justice unfold. For in that space of divine restraint lies the power to preserve the spiritual destiny of the faithful, to prevent the blessing from being consumed by those who refuse to change, who cling to their rebellion as a shield against divine correction. The heavens seem to hold their breath in anticipation, as if waiting for the moment when divine boundaries will be acknowledged and obeyed. This story is not merely a tale of divine discipline, but a sacred revelation, a divine secret hidden within the pages of Scripture, waiting for those willing to seek with open hearts. It is a call to discernment, to recognize that love without wisdom can become a trap, a form of manipulation that blinds us from the divine purpose. The shadows whisper of the danger in helping those who resist change, of the spiritual toll it takes on those who are called to lead and serve. As the celestial echoes grow louder, the question lingers: are we truly walking in divine obedience, or are we unknowingly blocking the very blessings that seek to descend upon us? Support this divine mission by subscribing, liking, and activating notifications. This is more than a gesture. It's a sacred act of spreading truth to those who need to hear, who need to see the divine hand guiding their lives. Together, through faith and obedience, we can unlock the spiritual mysteries that have been hidden for generations. And so, as the spiritual curtain begins to lift, prepare to witness a revelation that will challenge everything you thought you knew about love, obedience, and divine justice. The divine secrets are about to unfold, and the truth awaits those who are willing to see beyond the surface. The moment of divine clarity is drawing near, and the greatest revelations are yet to come. Throughout history, divine wisdom has often been hidden in plain sight, waiting for those with spiritual discernment to recognize its importance. The divine whisper reminds us that divine commands are not always easy to accept or understand at first glance. Many believers operate under the assumption that showing compassion is always the right thing to do, but divine truth reveals that there are moments when withholding help is an act of obedience and protection. This is not about cruelty or judgment, but about recognizing divine boundaries and understanding that true mercy sometimes involves silence. When God commands his people to cease interceding for certain individuals or groups, it is because he is protecting the spiritual integrity of his plan. This divine strategy is designed to prevent blessings from being contaminated or misused by those who refuse to turn away from rebellion or stubbornness. The divine whisper emphasizes that divine love is not reckless or indiscriminate. Instead, it is rooted in divine wisdom, which considers the long-term spiritual health of the individual and the community. When someone stubbornly resists correction or refuses to change, their continued presence can become an obstacle to divine breakthroughs, not only for themselves, but also for others around them. Helping those who are unwilling to accept divine discipline can inadvertently reinforce their resistance, making it more difficult for them to experience true transformation. Moreover, it can drain the spiritual strength of those who are called to serve, distracting them from their divine purpose. This divine insight urges believers to discern when their acts of compassion serve divine purposes, and when they may be enabling toxicity or rebellion. It is crucial to understand that divine boundaries are set out of love and wisdom, not judgment. The divine whisper gently reminds us that obedience to God's commands sometimes requires us to step back, even from those we care about deeply. This act of obedience is an exercise of faith, trusting that God's divine plan is perfect and that his boundaries are meant to protect his children from harm. By respecting divine boundaries, believers align themselves with God's wisdom, opening the door for divine blessings to flow freely and unimpeded. Recognizing the importance of divine boundaries is a sign of spiritual maturity, allowing believers to walk in obedience and to trust that God's divine strategy is always rooted in love, justice, and ultimate good. The divine whisper reveals a profound truth often overlooked in the realm of spiritual love. Not every act of compassion is truly aligned with God's divine plan. Many believers operate from a well-meaning desire to help everyone, but divine wisdom teaches us that unconditional mercy can sometimes become a trap. When we extend help to those resistant to change or correction, we risk enabling toxic behaviors that hinder their spiritual growth. This type of love, though seemingly virtuous, can inadvertently become a tool of manipulation or control, especially when it is given without discernment. The divine whisper encourages us to see beyond surface-level kindness and to seek divine guidance in our acts of love. True compassion should always be rooted in God's will, which sometimes requires us to hold back, to pray from afar, or to step away altogether for the sake of divine protection. This divine insight helps believers understand that divine boundaries are not punitive, but protective. When the Lord commands us to cease praying or intervening for certain individuals, it is because he recognizes their hardened hearts and knows that continued help might only deepen their resistance. It is a divine act of mercy to recognize when our efforts are no longer productive and to trust God's divine judgment. In these moments, obedience requires humility and trust that God's ways are higher than ours. While it may seem harsh from a human perspective, divine wisdom sees the bigger picture and understands that sometimes the greatest act of love is to release, step back, or even let go of certain relationships or situations. This divine strategy preserves the spiritual integrity of those involved and safeguards the blessings meant for God's children. The divine whisper invites believers to reflect on their motives and actions, urging them to seek God's discernment in every act of love. Genuine love is not merely about giving or rescuing, but about aligning with divine purpose. When love is tainted by selfish motives or blind compassion, it can become a barrier rather than a bridge to divine blessings. Learning to discern when divine boundaries are necessary is a sign of spiritual maturity. It is a demonstration of trust in God's divine plan and His perfect timing. Ultimately, the divine whisper calls believers to walk in obedience, understanding that sometimes the most loving act is to step back, pray, and trust that God's justice and mercy will prevail at the right time and in the right way. This is true obedience, aligning our actions with divine wisdom for the ultimate good of all involved. The divine whisper reveals a truth that many overlook. Love, when misapplied, can become a double-edged sword. Genuine compassion is rooted in divine wisdom, which recognizes that not every act of kindness serves the highest good. Sometimes the most loving action is to hold back, to refrain from intervening, and to trust that God's divine timing will bring about the right change. When we rush to help those resistant to correction, we risk enabling their stubbornness rather than guiding them toward true transformation. Such misguided compassion can inadvertently reinforce toxic patterns, making it harder for divine blessings to flow freely into their lives. It can also drain our spiritual strength, distracting us from our divine purpose and calling. The divine whisper gently reminds us that love without discernment can be manipulative, offering false hope when divine wisdom calls for restraint. This divine insight encourages believers to develop discernment and humility. Recognizing when to step back is not a sign of weakness, but an act of obedience rooted in trust in God's divine plan. Sometimes, the most compassionate act is to pray from afar or to release someone into God's hands, understanding that divine justice and mercy work together to bring about true change. When we attempt to force change or continue helping those who resist it, we may be blocking the very blessings that God intends to pour out. The divine strategy often involves a period of waiting, trusting that God's timing will reveal the right moment for intervention. This approach preserves spiritual integrity and prevents blessings from being diverted or delayed due to stubborn resistance. The divine whisper calls believers to examine their motives and actions carefully. Love, when aligned with divine wisdom, is about guiding others toward their spiritual destiny, not about enabling rebellion or toxicity. It's essential to understand that divine boundaries are set out of love, not judgment. Resisting the urge to intervene constantly and instead trusting God's divine justice can lead to greater spiritual breakthroughs. Obedience is about aligning with God's divine order, which sometimes means stepping back and trusting that His mercy and justice will work in perfect harmony. Walking in obedience involves patience, humility, and faith, knowing that God's plan is always for the ultimate good. When we learn to recognize divine boundaries and respect them, we position ourselves to receive the blessings and breakthroughs that God has prepared for us and those we love. This divine wisdom ultimately leads us closer to His perfect will. Sometimes, love can become complicated when we fail to see the full picture of divine wisdom. The divine whisper teaches us that genuine love is not about giving endlessly without discernment. It's about aligning our actions with God's divine purpose, understanding that at times the most compassionate act is to hold back. This may seem counterintuitive, especially in a world that promotes constant help and immediate rescue. However, divine wisdom reminds us that there are moments when the greatest act of love is to trust God's timing and His divine boundaries. When we push beyond what God has instructed, we risk disrupting His plan and unintentionally blocking blessings not only for others, but also for ourselves. Recognizing when to step aside is an act of humility and obedience, rooted in faith that God's justice and mercy will work together at the right moment. Obedience to God's divine boundaries is not a sign of weakness, but of strength. It requires discernment to know when our help might become an obstacle. We often want to see immediate change, but divine timing is much greater than ours. Sometimes, stepping back allows God's Spirit to work in ways we cannot see or understand. When we resist the urge to constantly intervene, we open space for divine intervention that is more powerful and lasting. This is especially true when dealing with individuals who resist correction or refuse to change. Continually helping them without divine guidance can reinforce their rebellion or toxicity, which ultimately hinders their spiritual progress. The divine whisper emphasizes that true love respects divine boundaries because it trusts that God's plan is perfect and that His justice will prevail. Furthermore, respecting divine boundaries protects our spiritual walk. It prevents us from becoming distracted or drained by relationships that are resistant to divine transformation. When we recognize that some situations are beyond our control and that divine timing is essential, we conserve our spiritual energy for more fruitful and divine assignments. Trusting God's boundaries is an act of faith, affirming that He knows what is best for His children. It also demonstrates that our love is rooted in divine wisdom rather than human emotion. When we align ourselves with God's divine strategy, we position ourselves to receive His blessings and to be instruments of His divine will. Ultimately, the divine whisper reminds us that obedience and discernment are vital in love's expression, ensuring that our acts of compassion serve God's ultimate purpose and lead to His divine blessings. The divine whisper reminds us that true love is rooted in divine wisdom, which often requires us to see beyond our immediate feelings and desires. Many people believe that helping others unconditionally is always the right course of action, but divine insight reveals that there are moments when love means knowing when to step back. It is crucial to understand that divine boundaries are not acts of rejection or indifference. Rather, they are expressions of divine love designed to protect both the helper and the one in need. Sometimes, continuing to help someone resistant to change can do more harm than good, both spiritually and emotionally. It can reinforce unhealthy patterns, prevent genuine transformation, and hinder divine blessings from flowing freely. The divine whisper urges us to develop discernment, to pray for guidance, and to trust God's divine timing in every situation. Recognizing when to hold back is an act of faith. It requires humility to accept that we do not have all the answers and that divine wisdom surpasses our understanding. When we try to force change or continue helping those who refuse correction, we risk becoming entangled in their resistance, which can drain our spiritual strength and distract us from our divine calling. Instead, the divine strategy often involves trusting God's justice and mercy to work in His perfect time. This trust is not easy. It demands patience and a deep understanding that divine boundaries are established out of love, not punishment. By respecting these boundaries, we create space for God's Spirit to move powerfully in ways that we cannot see or control. It is an act of obedience that aligns us with divine purpose and opens the door for divine blessings to be released. Moreover, the divine whisper emphasizes that love is a divine attribute that must be exercised with wisdom. Genuine love considers the spiritual health of everyone involved. It means knowing when to speak, when to listen, and when to stay silent. Sometimes, the greatest act of love we can show is to trust God's plan and to allow Him to work in the hearts of others. This approach not only protects our spiritual integrity, but also ensures that our actions are aligned with divine will. When we learn to recognize divine boundaries and walk in obedience, we position ourselves to receive the fullness of God's blessings. We must remember that God's love is perfect and His boundaries are set to guide us toward our highest good. Trusting in divine wisdom, especially in moments of difficulty, is essential for walking in true obedience and experiencing divine breakthroughs. As we reflect on this divine truth, let us remember that God's wisdom surpasses our human understanding. His boundaries are not restrictions born of cruelty, but are acts of divine love meant to protect, preserve, and elevate His children. Sometimes, the greatest demonstration of faith is not in our relentless effort to fix, rescue, or control, but in surrendering to His divine timing and trusting His perfect plan. The biblical lessons we've explored remind us that obedience is not always easy. It requires humility, discernment, and a deep reverence for God's sovereignty. When we honor divine boundaries, we align ourselves with His divine purpose, opening the door for blessings, breakthroughs, and spiritual growth that no human effort can produce alone. This message is a sacred reminder that divine love is not reckless, but rooted in divine justice and mercy. It challenges us to examine our motives and actions, urging us to discern when our help might be hindering rather than healing. The divine strategy teaches us that sometimes true compassion involves stepping aside, trusting that God's Spirit is working behind the scenes in ways we cannot see. When we obey His commands, even when they are difficult, we position ourselves to receive His richest blessings and to walk in the fullness of our divine destiny. Remember, God's boundaries are designed to protect and propel us closer to His perfect will, not to separate us from His love. Let this truth sink deep into your heart. Obedience to divine boundaries is an act of faith that honors God's divine wisdom. It is a sacred act that guards your spiritual walk and preserves your calling. As you navigate life, remember that divine love is always accompanied by divine discernment. Trust that God's plan is greater than your understanding, and that His boundaries are set to lead you into abundant life. When you align yourself with His divine purpose, you become a vessel for His blessings, a witness to His wisdom, and a recipient of His divine grace. Support this message by subscribing to this channel. Your support helps keep these biblical truths alive and spreading. Like this video to show your appreciation and to help more people discover God's divine wisdom. Activate the notification bell so you never miss content that strengthens your faith and deepens your understanding of God's Word. Share this message with friends, family, and anyone who needs to hear the truth that can transform lives. Together, we can create a movement of believers who walk in obedience, discernment, and divine love. Remember, the divine whisper calls us to trust God's boundaries, knowing that His love is perfect, His justice is true, and His plan is always for our highest good. Let us walk in obedience with faith, knowing that as we do, we open ourselves to the divine blessings and breakthroughs that He has prepared for us. The divine truth is not just meant to be understood, but to be lived. May this revelation inspire you to walk in obedience, trusting that God's divine boundaries are the very pathway to your divine destiny.